Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
I was around 13 years old when this happened. My mother and I were on vacation in northern Sardinia, and one of the things I remember most about being there was the night sky. I grew up in a big city, so I was used to looking up and seeing only a handful of stars. Maybe a few bright ones. Maybe the moon. Most of the rest disappeared behind streetlights, buildings, and that constant orange glow cities put into the sky. Sardinia was different. At night, especially once we were away from the brighter towns, the sky felt enormous. There were stars everywhere, more than I was used to seeing. So whenever we were outside at night, I naturally spent a lot of time looking up. That night, my mother and I had gone to a restaurant in a nearby city. By the time we were heading back, darkness had already settled in for several hours. I do not remember the exact road anymore, but we were traveling through northern Sardinia toward where we were staying. I was looking through the window at the stars. Nothing was wrong. No storm, no sirens, no strange noises. Just a normal vacation night. Then, I noticed something red in the sky. At first, I did not understand what I was seeing. It was not the red blinking light of an airplane. It was not a star. It looked like fire. A red, burning object seemed to be coming down through the sky. I stared at it. Instead of disappearing immediately, it became more dramatic. The red seemed to grow. Then, I could see more of it. What had started as one bright thing seemed to become multiple burning pieces. From where I was sitting, it looked enormous. Not like the tiny shooting stars I had seen before. Those were usually just quick white streaks. You saw them for a second, and then they were gone. This looked completely different. It seemed like giant masses were burning in the sky. The colors changed as I watched. Red, deep orange, at moments almost purple, then darker again. It looked as though something huge had entered the atmosphere and was breaking apart while it fell. I remember thinking immediately that it had to be a meteorite. At 13, I was not thinking carefully about the difference between a meteor, meteoroid, and meteorite. To me, it was simply a giant rock from space burning up above us. And for a few seconds, I genuinely thought something catastrophic might be happening. I had learned about the extinction of the dinosaurs. Everyone knows the basic story when they are a kid. A huge asteroid hits Earth. Dust fills the atmosphere. Everything changes. Dinosaurs die. So when I looked up and saw what seemed to be enormous burning objects entering the sky, that was where my brain went. This is it. We're about to get wiped out like the dinosaurs. I do not remember calmly admiring it. I remember fear. The kind of fear that comes from seeing something you know is far beyond your control. There was nowhere to run. If some giant object from space really was about to hit Earth, what could anyone do? We were just driving back from dinner. There was no warning, no time to prepare. Nothing. I told my mother what I was seeing. I said I had seen a meteor. She did not believe that explanation. She told me it could not have been something like that because if it were that big, we would have heard it. That did not make me feel much better. I had seen something. I knew that. The fact that my mother dismissed it did not make the image disappear. By the time I looked again, the burning pieces were gone. The sky looked normal. Stars, darkness, nothing falling. But my mind was still completely stuck on what I had seen. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about the burning masses. I imagined something hitting the island. I imagined a shockwave, a giant explosion, the sea moving, the sky turning red. All the possibilities a frightened 13-year-old could create once given enough time in the dark. Nothing happened. Obviously, morning came normally. There had been no disaster, no impact, no emergency. But that did not stop me from thinking about it. For years afterward, whenever I told people the story, most of them did not believe me. Some probably thought I was exaggerating. Some assumed I had seen fireworks. Others probably thought I had seen an airplane or something else ordinary. But I still remember what it looked like. Something fiery entered the sky. It grew brighter. It appeared to break into pieces. Those pieces burned red and purple. Then they disappeared. The simplest explanation has always seemed to me that I really did see a meteor or some similar object burning up in the atmosphere. There is nothing supernatural about that. Objects enter Earth's atmosphere all the time. Most are tiny and disappear without anyone noticing. Sometimes, though, something larger creates a very bright event. What makes these events difficult to judge from the ground is that the sky gives you almost no reliable sense of scale. Something extremely high in the atmosphere can look as though it is falling directly nearby. A glowing object might appear enormous even when it is hundreds of kilometers away. The brain sees brightness and movement, but has very few reference points. That probably explains why I thought the pieces themselves were gigantic. They looked huge because the event looked huge. But I had no way to measure their actual size. The lack of sound does not necessarily mean my mother was right that it could not have been a meteor. At the time, I assumed any large object burning through the atmosphere should make an enormous noise immediately. But light and sound do not reach you in the same way. Something can happen very far away, and you can see it long before any sound arrives. Depending on the distance, atmospheric conditions, altitude, and whether the object actually produced a strong sonic boom in our direction, we might not have heard anything at all. At 13, though, I did not know enough about that. My mother saying, "We would have heard it," left me with a strange problem. If it was not a meteor, then what had I just seen? That uncertainty made the experience scarier. If someone had immediately said, yes, that was a meteor, it burned up safely, I probably would have gone to sleep excited instead of terrified. Instead, I had the image without the explanation. And when you are 13, uncertainty can turn something beautiful into something threatening very quickly. There are other possibilities. It could have been space debris. A piece of satellite or rocket hardware re-entering the atmosphere can sometimes break apart into multiple glowing fragments. From the ground, that can look incredibly dramatic. Several pieces can follow similar paths while burning in different colors. I had no way to tell the difference. To me, anything fiery falling from space was a meteor. There could also have been some kind of flare or fireworks much farther away. If we were looking toward another town or a boat offshore, something launched into the sky might have appeared strange from a distance. But the way I remember it moving and breaking apart felt much more like something traveling through the atmosphere than fireworks. Still, memory is not perfect. This happened years ago. The basic image stayed with me because I was afraid, but details may have changed. Maybe the colors were mostly red and orange, and over time I remembered purple more strongly. Maybe there were fewer pieces than I think. Maybe the event lasted only a few seconds, even though it felt longer. Fear changes time. A sudden event can feel slow because you are concentrating on every instant. I remember watching the object become more intense, but perhaps the entire thing happened very quickly. One reason I think it was probably a real atmospheric event is that it did not behave like something imaginary. I was already awake. I was not half asleep. I was outside or in a vehicle after dinner. I was deliberately looking at the stars before anything happened. There was no dream state involved. I noticed something unusual because I was already watching the sky. It appeared, changed, broke apart, then disappeared. That is exactly the kind of sequence you would expect from something burning up. There was also no paranormal interpretation in my mind. I did not think I saw a UFO. I did not think aliens were coming. I thought I saw a natural object from space. A very frightening natural object, but still natural. The fear came from understanding enough science to know that objects from space can be dangerous, while not understanding enough to judge whether what I was seeing actually posed a threat. That middle ground is a terrible place to be as a kid. You know asteroids exist. You know one is associated with the extinction of the dinosaurs. You know the thing in front of you looks like something falling from space. What you do not know is how large it is, how far away it is, whether it is going to hit, whether someone would warn you, whether there is anything anyone could do. So the imagination fills everything in. Looking back, the fact that the object seemed to disintegrate should have reassured me. I watched the pieces fade. Nothing continued toward the horizon in one solid mass. No impact flash appeared. No vibration. No shockwave. The event ended in the sky. That strongly suggests whatever I saw burned up or disappeared without reaching the ground anywhere near us. But at 13, I did not think in those terms. I only thought about what might happen next. I remember lying awake and expecting something. Maybe a distant explosion. Maybe sirens. Maybe people shouting. Maybe emergency news. Nothing came. Eventually, the silence itself became unsettling. If something enormous had happened in the sky, why was nobody reacting? Was I the only person who saw it? Had it happened too far away? Had I misunderstood what I was looking at? By morning, normal life had won. Breakfast, vacation, daylight, people going about their lives. No asteroid apocalypse. The world did not end. But the memory remained. I told people about it later, and the reactions were frustrating because most of them focused on whether I had identified the object correctly. Maybe I had not. That is fair. I cannot prove it was a meteor. But I did not need to know the exact scientific category to know I had seen something unusual in the sky. There was a bright red object. It seemed to fragment. The fragments burned different colors. Then they disappeared. That is what I remember. People sometimes treat unexplained as imaginary. Those are not the same thing. I may not know exactly what something was without having invented it. That is how I think about the experience now. I do not need to insist it was a massive meteorite. Maybe it was a smaller meteor. Maybe a fireball. Maybe space debris. Maybe something else. But whatever it was real enough to make 13-year-old me believe for a few seconds that the planet was in danger. The setting probably made it more intense. If I had seen the same thing over a city, there would have been streetlights, buildings, traffic, signs, and familiar objects everywhere. In Sardinia, I was already focused on how open and deep the sky looked. The stars were brighter than what I was used to. The darkness between them felt larger. Then, suddenly, something fiery appeared among them. The contrast was enormous. 1 second, peaceful night sky. The next, burning red fragments. There is also something unsettling about seeing a rare natural event without warning. A thunderstorm announces itself. Clouds gather. Wind changes. Lightning begins. You understand what is happening. A meteor gives you nothing. There is only normal sky. Then, suddenly something enters it at incredible speed. By the time you understand what you are seeing, it is already disappearing. That suddenness probably contributed to the fear. I had no preparation, no context, and no immediate confirmation afterward. My mother's reaction also stayed with me because she was the adult. At 13, adults are still supposed to have answers. I told her I had seen a meteor. Instead of saying yes, she basically told me that could not be what I saw. So now I had seen something that even the adult beside me did not understand. That makes an experience much bigger in a child's mind. If the adult is confused, then maybe the situation really is dangerous. Of course, she may simply not have seen it. Maybe she was watching the road or looking somewhere else. By the time I got her attention, it could have already faded. Without seeing the event herself, she had no reason to accept my interpretation. And saying we would have heard it was probably just her way of reassuring me. Maybe she saw how frightened I was. Maybe she thought dismissing the meteor idea would help. Instead, it gave me more questions. Years later, I can understand how completely ordinary the event may have been. Not ordinary in the sense that people see it every night, but ordinary in the sense that physics can explain it. A natural object enters the atmosphere. Friction and compression heat the material. It glows. It fragments. Different materials or temperatures produce different colors. The fragments fade. From the ground, it looks like pieces of fire falling from space. No apocalypse required. That explanation makes sense. It also does not ruin the memory for me. If anything, the natural explanation makes what I saw more impressive. I may have witnessed something that existed in space for an unimaginable amount of time, ending its journey above the Mediterranean. A piece of rock or debris moving through darkness suddenly became bright enough for a 13-year-old staring from below to notice it. For a few seconds, it burned brilliantly. Then, it was gone. There is something incredible about that. But as a child, wonder came second. Fear came first. I had grown up hearing about dinosaurs being wiped out by an asteroid, so I watched those burning pieces and genuinely thought maybe humanity had finally gotten its turn. It sounds dramatic now, almost funny. But childhood fear is often completely logical based on the information available. I knew big space rocks could hit Earth. I saw what looked like one. Therefore, danger, the missing piece, was scale. If I could have known the object was small enough to burn up harmlessly, I would have been fascinated. Instead, every glowing fragment looked massive. The colors made it worse. Red looked hot. Purple looked even stranger. It did not look like some harmless white shooting star making a quick streak. It looked violent, like the sky itself was burning. That image followed me into bed. Even after nothing happened for an hour, I could not relax. What if the impact happened somewhere else? What if there were more coming? What if it had been only the beginning? I kept imagining the dinosaurs. That was probably the first time I truly understood emotionally. That extinction was not only something that happened in textbooks. The universe contains objects that do not care about humans at all. Most will never affect us. But as a kid, seeing even a harmless example makes the possibility feel immediate. I think that is why I remember it so clearly. Not because I believe I survived some near apocalypse. I probably did not. The object most likely burned up without threatening anyone. But for those few seconds, I did not know that. I was 13, far from home, under a sky much darker and fuller of stars than the one I knew. I looked up expecting nothing more than constellations. Instead, something appeared red against the darkness. It grew brighter. Then, it seemed to split. More red. Orange, purple, burning pieces falling and fading one after another. Then, nothing. I told my mother I had seen a meteor. She said that was impossible because if it had been anything large, surely we would have heard it. I remember looking back into the darkness after that. The sky had already returned to normal. That was almost the strangest part. Something that looked enormous had just burned above us, and seconds later there was no trace. No smoke I could see, no sound, no explosion, just stars. For the rest of the night, I kept waiting for proof that my fear had been justified. None came. Morning arrived. Sardinia was still there. So were we. I eventually understood that the absence of disaster was the answer. Whatever I saw had ended in the atmosphere, or somewhere so far away that it had nothing to do with us. But I will never forget how it felt before I knew that. People can laugh or say I misidentified it. Maybe I did. I do not care much about the label anymore. Meteor, fireball, space debris, something else. I only know what I saw from that car window. A peaceful night sky suddenly filled with burning red fragments. For a few seconds, I watched something from above break apart in colors I had never seen in the sky before. And at 13 years old, with the dinosaurs very much on my mind, I genuinely believed I might be watching the beginning of the end of the world. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, we had 3 cats. I loved all of them, although one of them had a very different relationship with me than the others. That cat had a habit of biting and scratching me. Not constantly, and I still loved it, but the feeling sometimes seemed a little one-sided. I would want to pet it or pick it up, and it would decide it had had enough and use its claws to let me know. That was just part of its personality. Then the cat died. I do not remember exactly how long before this incident had happened, but it was recent enough that our normal routine had not fully changed. One of the things that stayed the same was the food bowls. Whenever I went downstairs to feed the cats, I still saw all 3 bowls. 2 belonged to the cats that were still alive. The third belonged to the cat that had died. I had not picked that bowl up yet. I do not know why. Maybe nobody had thought about it. Maybe I did not want to move it, because doing so would make the cat's absence feel more permanent. At 9 or 10 years old, I probably was not thinking about grief in those exact words. I just knew that the bowl was still there. And because the cat was gone, I no longer needed to put food in it. One day, I went downstairs to feed the 2 cats that were still with us. It should have been completely ordinary. I had done it many times. I knew where the bowls were. I knew how the cats normally behaved when they realized food was coming. Usually cats do not exactly hide their excitement at feeding time. They move around your feet. They follow you. They stare at the food. They may meow or try to get closer before you have even finished putting the bowls down. That day was different. As I walked past the dead cat's empty bowl, I noticed my other 2 cats. They were sitting there. Both of them were staring at me. That alone was not necessarily strange. Cats stare at people all the time. But something about the way they were doing it bothered me. They were completely still. I put their food down. They did not move. That was when I started getting really uncomfortable. Food was right there. Normally, they would have gone straight to it. Instead, they just sat there and watched me. I remember feeling like something was wrong, not in a clear way. There was no sound behind me. No door opened. I did not see the dead cat standing in the room. There was simply this strange stillness. 2 living cats staring. The third bowl sitting empty. And me suddenly becoming very aware that there used to be another animal there. I started thinking about the cat that had died. That probably made the moment worse. If the third bowl had belonged to a cat that was merely outside, maybe I would not have cared. But I knew that cat was never coming back. The bowl made that absence visible. The other two cats seemed to be reacting to something, or at least that was how it felt. I did not stay downstairs long enough to figure it out. I got creeped out and headed upstairs quickly. Very quickly. I was still a kid. Once the idea enters your head that something strange might be happening around the spot where your dead pet used to eat, you do not necessarily stand there investigating. You leave. After I got upstairs, I decided to take a shower. Maybe I was trying to continue with my normal morning or evening routine. Maybe I just wanted to stop thinking about the cats. Either way, I went into the bathroom and turned on the water. Everything seemed normal again. Then the hot water hit my face. I felt a sudden, stinging pain across my cheek. It was sharp enough to immediately get my attention. I touched my face or moved closer to the mirror to see what was wrong, and that was when I saw the scratches. There were 3 of them. 3 long, claw-like scratches running from around my nose down toward my jaw. They were roughly parallel, exactly the kind of marks that made me think of a cat. I just stared at them. As far as I remembered, those scratches had not been there before. I had not felt anything scratch me. Neither of the 2 living cats had touched my face downstairs. I had simply walked past the empty bowl, noticed the cats acting strangely, gone upstairs, and stepped into the shower. Then, suddenly, I had 3 long scratches across my face. At that age, it was almost impossible not to connect the events. My cat had died. That cat had always scratched me. Its food bowl was still sitting downstairs. The other cats had stared at me instead of eating. Then I found 3 claw marks on my face. The supernatural explanation practically wrote itself. Maybe the dead cat had scratched me. Maybe it was still around. Maybe the 2 living cats had seen it. Maybe that was what they had been staring at. And because this particular cat had always been the one that bit and scratched me while it was alive, the idea almost felt like its personality. One last scratch. That was certainly the way my child brain wanted to interpret it. Looking back now, though, there are plenty of normal explanations. The biggest one is incredibly simple. The scratches may already have been on my face before I went downstairs. I just had not noticed them yet. That sounds obvious now, but when you are a child, you tend to assume that if an injury suddenly hurts, it must have just happened. That is not always true. Small scratches can go unnoticed for quite a while. You might not feel them when they occur. Then, something irritates the skin later. Hot water, soap, sweat, cold air. That is when the injury suddenly becomes noticeable. A hot shower would be perfect for that. If I already had 3 shallow scratches on my cheek, the water could have caused them to sting immediately. Then, I looked in the mirror for the first time and saw them. From my perspective, it would feel as though the scratches had appeared between feeding the cats and taking the shower. But really, the only thing that appeared at that moment was the pain. The marks could have been there for hours. Maybe one of the living cats scratched me earlier in the day. Maybe the cat that had died had scratched me shortly before its death, and the marks were still healing. Depending on how close the timing was, that is possible. Maybe I scratched myself accidentally. Children get minor cuts constantly. Fingernails can leave several parallel marks that look very much like animal claws. If I scratched my face in my sleep, I might have had no memory of doing it. 3 or 4 fingernails dragging across the cheek can make exactly that pattern. The location from nose to jaw is also somewhere a hand could easily move while sleeping. Maybe my face itched. I scratched it hard enough to break the skin. Then I woke up and forgot. Later, the hot water revealed the marks. That explanation is probably far more likely than a dead cat physically scratching me. There is also the possibility that something ordinary happened between downstairs and the shower that I no longer remember. This happened when I was 9 or 10. Childhood memories preserve the dramatic moments and throw away the boring parts. Maybe I brushed against something. Maybe I changed clothes and a zipper or a rough edge caught my face. Maybe I was playing earlier and scraped myself. Maybe a branch scratched me outside. Maybe one of the cats swiped at me during an interaction that felt too ordinary to remember until the marks became part of a ghost story. Over time, the memory becomes simpler. Cats stare. I run upstairs. Shower, scratches, those are the important points. Everything between them disappears. That does not mean the memory is false. It means the sequence may not be as immediate as it feels now. The two cats staring at me also has plenty of normal explanations. Cats are strange animals. They can freeze and stare at something for reasons humans never understand. A tiny insect, a sound in the wall, a reflection, a smell, a movement too subtle for us to notice. Sometimes they stare at absolutely nothing we can identify. That does not mean they are seeing ghosts. They simply perceive the environment differently. Their hearing is more sensitive. Their sense of smell is far stronger. Their eyes respond differently to movement and low light. Maybe both cats heard something behind me. Maybe they were watching my hands because they were waiting for food. Maybe the presence of the third empty bowl changed their routine. Animals notice changes. If 3 cats had always eaten together, and now one was gone, the surviving cats may have behaved differently during feeding time. They could have been confused. They might have been waiting for the other cat. They might have smelled something associated with it around the bowl. Cats can react to the loss of another animal in ways we do not always understand. That could explain why they did not immediately eat. Maybe I interpreted normal hesitation as something eerie because I was already thinking about the dead cat. The empty bowl probably affected me too. I walked past it, knowing exactly why it was empty. That alone could put me in a strange emotional state. Grief does not always look like crying. Sometimes it makes familiar spaces feel wrong. A place where an animal used to sleep suddenly looks too empty. A food bowl becomes something you avoid looking at. You hear a sound and briefly expect the pet to come around the corner. For a child, those feelings can easily blend with fear. I may have already been uncomfortable simply because the cat was gone. Then the other cats acted unusually. My brain connected it. Something is wrong. The moment became supernatural before anything else had happened. Then the scratches appeared in the shower and seemed to confirm everything. That is how patterns form. One strange event changes the meaning of the next. If I had found the same scratches on some random morning before the cat died, I probably would have assumed one of the cats got me. Or I scratched myself. Maybe I would not have thought about them for more than 5 minutes. But because I noticed them after that strange feeding moment, they became important. Timing gave them meaning. The fact that there were 3 scratches made them look even more like claw marks. Cats commonly leave several parallel lines when they swipe. That made the association very strong. But human fingernails can do the same thing. If 4 fingers move across the face, but only 3 nails make enough contact to break the skin, the result can look exactly like 3 claw marks. A rough object with several edges can do it too. The pattern by itself does not identify the source. What made it feel like my dead cat was the history between us. I loved that cat, but it definitely liked scratching me. So if I imagined it returning somehow, scratching me seemed believable. Not because the cat hated me. Some cats are simply rough. They get overstimulated. They play aggressively. They do not want to be held. They communicate boundaries with teeth and claws. As a kid, I probably took that personally sometimes. I loved the cat more openly than it seemed to love me. After it died, maybe that complicated relationship made the scratch marks feel almost like a signature. If the cat had always been gentle, I might have thought differently. Maybe I would imagine it brushing against my leg or meowing. But this cat scratched. So 3 scratches became its calling card. There is something darkly funny about that interpretation now. Even after death, the cat still did not want me getting too comfortable. But that is just a story built around coincidence. There is no evidence the dead cat caused anything. Another thing worth considering is that I did not actually see the scratches appear. That is important. There was no moment where I looked into a mirror, saw clear skin, felt something invisible rake across my face, and then watched 3 lines form. That would be much harder to explain. Instead, I discovered the scratches after they began stinging in the shower. There is a gap. I do not know when they were created. That gives ordinary explanations plenty of room. They could have happened during sleep, during play, earlier that morning, the previous evening. Maybe they were already partly healed. The hot water simply made them obvious. Our brains often mistake the moment we discover something for the moment it happened. You find a bruise and think, where did that come from? The bruise did not magically appear when you noticed it. You simply do not remember the impact. Scratches can work the same way. I also do not remember checking whether there was blood. Were they fresh and bleeding? Were they red but superficial? Were they already beginning to scab? That detail could have helped establish when they happened. But I was a child. I was not thinking like an investigator. I saw 3 lines. I knew what they looked like. Cat scratches. That was enough. The shower itself probably made them look worse. Hot water increases blood flow near the skin. Minor scratches can become redder and more visible. Skin around them can swell slightly. Something that was almost invisible before can suddenly look dramatic after several minutes under warm water. So it is entirely possible that I had walked past mirrors or reflective surfaces earlier without noticing them. Then the shower made them stand out. Again, ordinary, but ordinary explanations do not necessarily remove the memory. What I remember most is the sequence of feelings. First, the empty bowl. Then the 2 cats staring. Then the sense that something was wrong. Then running upstairs. Then the relief of getting into a normal activity, like a shower. Then sudden pain. And finally seeing the scratches. For a 9-year-old, that feels like a message. Something downstairs noticed you. You ran. It followed. That is how I experienced it emotionally, even though nothing actually followed me upstairs. The cats never chased me. I heard no footsteps. There was no scratching at the bathroom door. No ghostly meow. No figure appeared in the mirror. There was no supernatural event beyond the interpretation I gave the scratches. That makes me more cautious now. If the cat's spirit truly intended to scratch me, why was the only evidence an injury I could easily have gotten earlier? Why did nothing else happen? Why did the cat never appear again? Those questions do not disprove anything, but they make the ordinary explanations stronger. The most likely answer is probably that I had scratched my face without realizing it, or one of the living cats had done it earlier, and the timing made it seem connected to the cat that died. But I still understand why the other cats bothered me. Animals sometimes behave in ways that make humans feel watched. 2 cats sitting completely still and staring at the same person can be unsettling even in a normal situation. Add an empty bowl belonging to a recently dead cat, and it becomes much harder not to assign meaning to it. Maybe they smelled their old companion. Maybe they were waiting for something. Maybe they were simply staring because I was the person holding their food. I do not know. I only know that at the time I felt strongly enough about it to leave downstairs quickly. And that fear probably made everything afterward more intense. I think childhood is full of moments like that. You experience two ordinary events close together, and they become permanently linked. A light flickers while someone talks about a dead relative. A toy turns on after a funeral. A pet stares at an empty hallway. Then something else strange happens. Years later, you remember the connection more clearly than you remember the individual causes. That does not make the experience meaningless. It just means meaning and cause are different things. Maybe there was nothing supernatural in my house that day. The event still became part of how I remembered that cat. Death had already made the animal mysterious in a way. As a kid, I understood that it was gone, but death itself was still difficult to process. One day, there is a living animal that bites you, scratches you, eats from a bowl, sleeps somewhere in the house. Then suddenly, it does none of those things. But its bowl is still there. Its hair is probably still on furniture. Its smell may still be on blankets. Its absence feels almost like another presence. You keep expecting it. That can do strange things to a child's imagination. Maybe I was already thinking about whether some part of the cat was still around. Then the other two cats behaved strangely. Then the scratches appeared. It gave that question a shape. For a while, I probably believed the answer was yes. The cat was still around, and apparently it still wanted to scratch me. Now, I would not say that with certainty. There is simply not enough evidence. 3 scratches do not prove anything paranormal. Neither do 2 cats staring. The strongest normal explanation is that the injury happened earlier, and I only noticed it when hot water made it sting. That accounts for the biggest mystery, without requiring anything unusual. The rest can be explained by animal behavior, grief, and a frightened child's interpretation. But every now and then, I still picture that morning. The 2 cats sitting there, their food placed in front of them. Neither one moving, just staring at me. The 3rd bowl still sitting where it always had, even though the cat it belonged to was dead. I remember how quickly I decided I did not want to be downstairs anymore. Then, I remember stepping into the shower, hot water hitting my cheek. That sudden sting. Looking into the mirror, 3 long lines running from my nose toward my jaw, exactly the kind of scratches that cat had given me more than once while it was alive. Maybe they had been there all morning. Maybe I scratched myself in my sleep. Maybe one of the surviving cats caught me earlier, and I forgot. Those explanations make far more sense than a dead pet returning to take one last swipe at me. Still, if you asked 9-year-old me what happened, I probably would have had a much simpler answer. My cat was dead. Its bowl was empty. The other 2 cats were staring at something I could not see. I ran upstairs, and a few minutes later, when the hot water hit my face, I discovered 3 fresh-looking claw marks where I could have sworn there had been none before. When I was fairly young, somewhere between 7 and 13, my mother, my sister, and I moved to Quebec after my parents divorced. The divorce itself was not some horrible, dramatic thing. It was a healthy separation, and my mother was doing what she could to make sure we were happy. The harder part was finding somewhere that actually felt like home. For several years, we moved around a lot. My mother had recently gotten together with my stepfather, who had 2 daughters of his own. That meant our family suddenly became much bigger. There were a lot of us. My mother wanted a house where everyone could have enough space, and Ideally, their own bedroom, so we were not constantly on top of each other. Considering what she was making at the time, looking back, I am honestly impressed with the places she managed to find. Some of the houses were nice, some were temporary. A few blended together in my memory. But one of the last houses we lived in before I eventually moved back to Alberta has always stood out, mostly because of the basement. The house itself was huge. We had 2 floors to ourselves, and above us were apartments where other people lived. The layout was a little unusual. There were 3 bedrooms positioned almost in an L shape around a massive kitchen. Down one hallway were the living room, bathroom, and my parents' bedroom. Between the bathroom and the hall leading toward my parents' room was the basement door. I hated that door. I was already the kind of kid who found basements creepy, so it did not need to do much to bother me. The fact that the house was old did not help. We were in Quebec, where plenty of houses are far older than the ones I had been used to, and you could feel that age in certain parts of the building. The basement was one of them. It had never been properly finished. The walls and floors looked rougher. It was colder than the rest of the house. The space was huge, but strangely empty, almost like the entire footprint of the house had been copied underground, and then somebody forgot to actually turn it into rooms. Our washer and dryer were down there, so the basement could not simply be ignored. We also stored boxes there when we first moved in. That meant there were always stacks of things around, especially during those first months. And attached to the basement was an old root cellar. That was the part I found especially creepy. The root cellar looked ancient. My parents kept it locked, mainly because they did not want a bunch of kids going in there and hurting themselves. That was a completely reasonable decision. Old, unfinished storage spaces can have broken boards, rusty nails, unstable shelves, damp floors, and all kinds of things children should not be climbing around. But telling a child that old door is locked and you cannot go in there does not make the area feel safer. It makes the imagination worse. As a kid, a locked ancient room in a basement is almost impossible not to think about. During the summer, though, the basement was actually useful because it stayed cold. On hot days, it could be one of the nicest places in the house. So even though I was uncomfortable down there, I still went into it. One day, my friend came over. I will call her Sarah. We decided to go downstairs and play. We had this wooden dollhouse stored in the basement. It was one of those simple ones that came apart into flat pieces. You could slide the walls together through little slots and assemble it without much effort. The dolls were also basic, almost like little wooden chunks shaped into people. It was not some expensive, realistic dollhouse. But when you are a kid, you do not care. We could sit there for ages making up stories. So Sarah and I went downstairs to play with it. Almost immediately, she commented on how creepy the basement was. I probably agreed, even if I acted like I did not. Then she pointed something out. There was a small door leaning nearby. I remember it being covered in old chipped pink paint. On it were 2 simple stick figures holding hands. I do not remember what the door originally belonged to. Maybe it had come off a cupboard. Maybe it was part of some old children's furniture. Maybe it belonged somewhere else in the house and had simply been stored downstairs. I only remember that it was there. And I did not like it. There was no obvious reason for that. It was just an old painted door. The stick figures themselves were not especially frightening. 2 people holding hands should actually be one of the least threatening things you could draw. But something about it bothered me. Even now, I cannot really explain why. Maybe it was the chipped paint. Maybe the basement lighting made it look strange. Maybe it was simply because Sarah had already said the room was creepy, and now I was looking for things to agree with that feeling. Whatever the reason, I remember noticing it. Then we sat down with the dollhouse and started playing. For a while, everything was normal. At some point, Sarah said something like, "What if there's a creepy ghost down here?" That is exactly the kind of thing kids say when they know the other kid is already nervous. I told her not to be stupid. I did not want to think about ghosts, especially not while sitting in an unfinished old basement beside a locked root cellar. She was probably trying to scare me. I tried to ignore it. Then one of the dollhouse windows opened. And then, as I remember it, more than one of them moved. These were not loose little pieces that constantly flapped around. The windows were actually difficult to open. You had to pry them with your fingers. The wood fit tightly enough that when we played with the house, opening one took some effort. That was why seeing them move on their own caught my attention. I stopped playing. I stared at the dollhouse. For a second, I did not know what to say. My first reaction was not, "We have a ghost." My first reaction was to blame Sarah. Somehow, in my child brain, she had said the word ghost, and then the windows opened, so she must have done something. I looked at her. I told her to stop. She denied it. I accused her again. She told me she had not touched them. I was already getting angry, because being angry was easier than admitting I was scared. Maybe she had bumped the dollhouse. Maybe she had pulled a string I could not see. Maybe the whole thing was a joke. That was what I wanted it to be. Before we could really start arguing about it, something much louder happened. The little pink door Sarah had pointed out earlier fell. It did not slowly slide down the wall. It hit the ground with a loud bang. Both of us jumped. I remember the sound being much louder than I expected because the door was heavier than the dollhouse pieces. We looked over. It was lying flat. That was enough. We ran. I do not remember carefully putting the dollhouse away. I do not remember checking whether the windows were still open. I definitely did not walk over to inspect the pink door. Sarah and I got out of that basement as fast as we could. I had never run up those stairs so quickly. Once we were upstairs, the basement stopped being a place to play. We told my parents. We told my sisters. Nobody really believed us. Or at least nobody treated it with the level of seriousness we thought it deserved. To the adults, there were plenty of ordinary explanations. The dollhouse was old. Something shifted. The door had been leaning and finally fell over. Two kids got scared because they had just been talking about ghosts. That was probably all they saw. And honestly, looking at it now, those explanations are not unreasonable. The pink door is probably the easiest part to explain. It was leaning. Anything leaning against a wall is already unstable. It may have looked secure to two children without actually being balanced properly. Old basement floors are rarely perfectly level. A tiny vibration could have shifted it. Someone walking upstairs. A washing machine entering a cycle. A truck passing outside. One of us moving nearby. Even the movement from both of us suddenly reacting to the dollhouse could have been enough. If the bottom of the door slipped even slightly, gravity would do the rest. At the time, I remember thinking it could not have fallen naturally because of the way it had been positioned. In my mind, something would have needed to lift it away from where it was leaning and push it outward. But I was a child. I did not measure its angle. I did not test the floor. I did not go back and carefully recreate how it had been standing. I was frightened and ran. So when I say there was no way it could have fallen by itself, that is how it felt to me then. It is not something I can prove now. The dollhouse windows are a little more interesting, but they can also have ordinary explanations. Wood changes with temperature and humidity. The basement was cold. If the dollhouse had been stored in boxes, moved between different parts of the house, or recently assembled, pieces could have been under tension. A window that normally felt stiff might shift if the frame flexed. The house itself could have been sitting unevenly on the floor. One of us may have nudged it without realizing. A hand touching one wall could transfer movement through the entire structure. Maybe Sarah really did move the windows and denied it because she wanted to scare me. Kids do that. Maybe I moved them accidentally and forgot. Maybe only one opened slightly. And over the years, the memory became several windows creaking open. That is possible, too. Childhood memories can remain emotionally clear while physical details change. I remember the feeling of staring at the windows and knowing they should not have moved. That does not necessarily mean my understanding of the mechanism was correct. Airflow is another possibility. At the time, I remember thinking the windows were too stiff for wind to open. That may be true, but basements can have strange pressure differences. If a door upstairs opened or closed, air could move through the stairwell. A furnace or ventilation system might switch on. The dollhouse windows were small, but a pressure change combined with loose hinges or warped wood could move them. I would not call that the most obvious explanation, but it is possible. The important part is that the two events happened close together. First, Sarah said something about a ghost. Then the dollhouse moved. Then the old door crashed to the floor. Once those things were placed into one sequence, it felt intentional. Something heard us talking. Something moved the dollhouse. Then something knocked the door over. That is the supernatural version. But three events happening near each other do not automatically share a cause. Sarah's comment might have primed us to notice something we would normally ignore. The dollhouse could have shifted naturally. Our reaction could have caused enough vibration to destabilize the door. The door falls. Now everything feels connected. That explanation is very plausible. Fear changes the way you pay attention. Before Sarah mentioned a ghost, the basement was merely creepy. Afterward, every little noise became evidence. A creak is not the house settling anymore. It is something moving. A dollhouse window opening is not warped wood. It is a response. A heavy object falling is not gravity. Something pushed it. Children are especially good at turning separate events into one story. I know that because I did exactly that. At the same time, I still remember how immediate our reaction was. Sarah was scared too. That mattered to me. If she had laughed after the door fell, I would have known it was a prank. Instead, she ran with me. Maybe she was simply feeding off my panic. Or maybe she was genuinely confused by what happened. I have never known. The root cellar added another layer to everything, even though nothing actually came from it. It was locked. We never saw anyone inside. No hand came through the door. No voice came from behind it. But because it was old and off limits, it naturally became part of the atmosphere. The basement already contained an unknown space. That made the rest easier to interpret as haunted. Old houses do this to people. They contain more sounds, more movement, more signs of previous use. A modern finished basement has drywall, bright lights, straight floors, and clean storage shelves. An unfinished basement in an old house has exposed surfaces, old doors, forgotten objects, cracks, drafts, pipes, and shadows. Each one gives the imagination material. The age of the house also mattered. As a kid, old house basically meant more likely to have ghosts. It is a simple equation. Old people lived there. Some of them must have died. Therefore, ghosts. That is not evidence of anything, but it is exactly how children think. The fact that there were apartments above us probably contributed to strange sounds too. People lived overhead. Footsteps and furniture could travel through the structure. A door closing upstairs might sound as though it came from our floor. A child running above might create vibrations all the way into the basement. Plumbing connected multiple units. Water moving through pipes could make banging or ticking noises. A building with several households is never truly quiet. even when your own family is. At the time, I did not think about any of that. I only thought about the basement. Looking back, I also realized the pink door may have had an ordinary history that would have made it much less frightening if I had known it. The chipped pink paint and stick figures suggest it might have belonged to some children's furniture, a play area, cupboard, or old decorative piece. Maybe another family had children there before us. Maybe it had been left behind because it was useless. That does not mean anything bad happened. Old houses accumulate objects. You move into a place and discover a shelf nobody bothered to remove. A broken chair, an old cabinet door, a jar in the basement. Something gets left by one tenant, then ignored by the next. After enough years, nobody knows where it came from. A child sees that history without context, and it feels mysterious. The stick figures holding hands bothered me because they suggested people. Children, maybe a family. My imagination could do the rest. There is no actual reason to believe the door was connected to anything paranormal. Still, I remember it more clearly than many normal objects from that house. That says more about fear and memory than it does about the door itself. The strange thing is that the basement incident was not the only weird experience our family associated with that house. My siblings and I had other moments that made us uncomfortable. I do not want to use those as proof, though. Once a house gets a reputation inside a family, everything that happens afterward is interpreted through it. One person hears a sound. Another says they saw a shadow. Someone has a bad dream. The house becomes the weird house. Then, every new story strengthens the previous ones. That can happen even if each incident has its own normal explanation. Years later, the stories merge into one atmosphere. That may have happened with us. Recently, my mother brought up the times we got scared as kids. She remembered us talking about the scary basement. Hearing her mention it again brought the whole memory back. The old house, the stairs, the cold basement, the dollhouse, the pink door. Sarah asking, what if there was a ghost? Then the windows opening. Then, the bang. For a second, I could almost feel the same panic I had as a kid. My mother remembering that we were frightened does not prove anything happened down there. It does confirm that the basement had enough of a reputation for us to keep talking about it. That is interesting on its own. As an adult, I am much less certain about calling the house haunted than I would have been then. At 9 or 10 years old, I probably would have said absolutely. Something was there. Now, I think there are too many gaps. I never saw a person. I never saw an apparition. I never heard a voice clearly speaking. Nothing touched me. The dollhouse moved. A leaning door fell. Those are strange events, but they are also the kind of things that can happen naturally. The fact that they occurred seconds apart made them frightening. That is the strongest part of the story, not what happened individually. The timing. Sarah mentions a ghost. A window opens. We react. A heavy door falls. Run. If you wrote that sequence into a horror movie, it would look intentional. In real life, coincidence can create the same structure without intention. That is something I have learned over the years. But understanding that does not erase the original experience. I still know how wrong the basement felt in that moment. Maybe the feeling came entirely from us. Two children in an old unfinished basement, surrounded by boxes and an off-limits root cellar, telling each other ghost stories. That is enough to generate fear without anything supernatural. Once we became scared, normal movement stopped looking normal. But there is still part of me that remembers the dollhouse windows and thinks those were hard to open. And part of me that remembers the pink door and thinks it did not just slide, it came down hard. Memory is stubborn like that. Logic can explain something without completely replacing the feeling. I think that is why I still consider that house one of the strangest places I lived as a child. We moved so many times because my mother was trying to build a home large enough for our new family. Most of those houses faded into the background. That one did not. Maybe because it was old, maybe because the layout was unusual, maybe because the basement was enormous and unfinished, maybe because the locked root cellar gave us an easy place to put every fear we had, maybe because several siblings experienced things there and reinforced one another's memories, or maybe something genuinely unexplained happened. I cannot prove it either way. If I could go back now, I would probably do what I was too frightened to do as a child. I would inspect the dollhouse, test the hinges, set the pink door back where it had been, see how stable it actually was, check the basement floor, look for vents, see whether footsteps upstairs made objects shake. I might solve the whole thing in 10 minutes. Or maybe everything would remain still. That is the frustrating part of childhood experiences. By the time you are old enough to investigate them properly, the place is gone from your life. All you have is memory. I eventually moved back to Alberta. The Quebec house became another place our family had lived. I stopped thinking about the basement every day. The fear faded. But I never forgot that afternoon with Sarah. We went downstairs because we wanted to play with a wooden dollhouse. She joked about there being a ghost. I told her not to be stupid. Then the little windows that were always difficult to move seemed to creak open by themselves. I blamed her. Before we could really argue, the old pink painted door with the two stick figures holding hands hit the basement floor with a bang. Neither of us stayed long enough to look for an explanation. We ran. Maybe the dollhouse had warped. Maybe one of us bumped it. Maybe the heavy door was balanced worse than we realized and chose exactly the wrong moment to fall. Those explanations are reasonable. Probably more reasonable than a ghost moving toys in an old basement. But even now, when I picture that house, I do not first remember the huge kitchen, or the bedrooms, or the apartments overhead. I remember the basement. I remember the locked root cellar. I remember that little pink door leaning there. And I remember the exact moment Sarah asked what we would do if there was a ghost downstairs. A few seconds later, the dollhouse opened itself. Then the door came crashing down.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
When I was a child, I had a habit of waking up with a ridiculous amount of energy. I was not one of those kids who needed 20 minutes to remember where they were or had to lie in bed staring at the ceiling before getting up. Most mornings, once my eyes opened, I was ready to move. This particular morning started exactly like that. I woke up hungry. My first thought was food, so I got out of bed and headed toward the kitchen. Our back door was right beside the kitchen. It was mostly glass, with curtains covering it. And I had this little routine where I would pull the curtains aside and look into the backyard whenever I walked past. I have no idea why. There usually was not anything interesting to see. Just the patio. The yard, whatever the weather was doing. But kids develop habits for no real reason, and looking outside was one of mine. So that morning, before going into the kitchen, I opened the curtains and looked through the glass. Everything was normal. Empty patio. Normal backyard. Nothing moving. nothing standing there. I closed or moved away from the curtains and went into the kitchen. I opened the freezer because I was looking for something to eat. And there it was, ice cream. Now, as a kid, seeing ice cream first thing in the morning immediately gave me the greatest idea I had ever had. Ice cream for breakfast. Obviously, the only problem was getting permission. So I ran back to my mother's room. She was still asleep. I woke her up and asked if I could have ice cream for breakfast. She was barely conscious. I do not know whether she understood the question. Maybe she thought I asked for cereal. Maybe she just wanted me to stop talking so she could sleep. Whatever happened, she mumbled yes. I could not believe it. This felt like winning the lottery. I remember thinking, she actually said yes. I had official permission. There was no time to waste before she woke up properly and realized the terrible decision she had just made. I ran back toward the kitchen, completely excited. And because I was a creature of habit, when I passed the back door again, I looked outside. Only a minute or two could have passed since the first time. The patio had been completely empty. Now there was something standing on it. At first, I thought it was a tree. It looked roughly like a small pine tree, maybe the size and shape of a normal Christmas tree. Not one of the enormous ones people put in shopping centers, just the kind a family might have inside their house. It was standing upright in the middle of a patio that normally had nothing like that on it. That alone confused me. There had not been a tree there when I looked outside moments earlier. We did not keep a Christmas tree on the patio. There were no potted trees sitting there. There should have been nothing. I stared at it. The longer I looked, the stranger it became. My eyes moved downward. At the bottom of the tree were feet. Human feet. That is the detail that has stayed with me more than anything else. Not roots, not a pot. Feet. Two human-looking feet sticking out underneath this upright tree-shaped thing. I remember trying to understand what I was looking at. Maybe there was someone hiding inside branches. Maybe it was a person wearing something. Maybe I had somehow missed a decoration being placed outside. But I did not have long to think. The thing moved. It jumped toward me, except the movement did not look normal. Even as a child, that was what disturbed me. I saw the feet bend or lift as though preparing to jump. Then, the figure seemed to disappear from one position and reappear farther forward at the end of the jump. It was almost like frames were missing. Today, the best word I can think of is glitched. At the time, I obviously did not think in terms of animation frames or digital glitches. I just knew the movement looked wrong. I could see the beginning. Then, somehow, I was seeing the end. Not much in between. It landed closer to the door, then immediately did it again. Another jump. Same strange movement. Feet preparing. Then, suddenly, closer. It happened incredibly fast. A third jump brought it almost all the way to me. Within seconds, this tree-shaped figure that had been standing across the patio was inches from my face. Only the glass door separated us. I screamed. There was no moment where I bravely stood there studying it. I did not try to see whether there was a face hidden in the branches. I did not tap the glass. I did not ask what it wanted. I ran. I went straight back to my mother's bedroom and started yelling. "Mom, there's someone outside." I was trying to wake her fully. "Mom, wake up. There's someone outside." I must have sounded terrified. I definitely felt terrified. But my mother was still half asleep. Instead of jumping out of bed and investigating, she told me to go play in my room. I do not think she understood what I was trying to tell her. From her perspective, she had a hyperactive child waking her repeatedly early in the morning. First, I wanted ice cream. Now, someone was apparently outside. She probably thought I was imagining things or trying to get her attention. I went away. At some point, curiosity got the better of me. Or maybe I needed to know whether the thing was still there. I returned to the back door. I looked outside again. Nothing. The patio was empty. The tree was gone. No human feet. No figure. Nothing standing near the glass. Everything looked exactly as it had the first time I looked that morning. Normal backyard. Normal patio. That should have been the part where I remained traumatized for the rest of the day. Instead, I did one of the most childlike things imaginable. I remembered the ice cream. Apparently, my fear of the tree creature was not strong enough to erase the fact that I had received permission for ice cream for breakfast. So I went back to my mother again. By this point, after being woken up multiple times, she was much more conscious. I asked if I could still have the ice cream. Her earlier sleepy generosity had disappeared. She angrily told me no. So after supposedly seeing some impossible human-footed tree jump across our patio toward me, I ended up eating cereal. That detail almost makes the entire memory feel ridiculous. But maybe that is part of why I trust certain pieces of it. Childhood memories are often strange combinations of terror and completely ordinary concerns. 1 minute you think there is a monster outside. 5 minutes later, you are angry because you cannot have dessert for breakfast. For years, I have wondered what I actually saw that morning. There are some very normal possibilities. The strongest one is that I was not fully awake. I had just gotten out of bed. Even though I remember myself as the kind of child who woke up immediately full of energy, that does not necessarily mean my brain was completely out of a dream state. People can wake, walk around, speak to family members, and interact with the real environment while parts of dream imagery are still lingering. A vivid image can appear inside an otherwise normal room. This is especially possible when someone has only just awakened. Maybe I experienced something similar. I had already walked to the kitchen. I had opened the freezer. I had spoken to my mother. That makes it feel as though I must have been completely awake. But sleep and wakefulness are not always separated by a perfect switch. The brain can be awake enough to move and talk while still producing unusual visual experiences. If so, the backyard gave my brain a real setting. The patio was there. The door was there. The light was real. Then, some dream image appeared in the middle of it. A tree with feet. It sounds exactly like the kind of thing a child's dreaming brain could create. The strange jumping motion also fits. Dream movement does not always follow normal physics. Things jump without showing the full motion. People move from one place to another too quickly. Objects change position between glances. The glitching I remember could simply have been dream imagery being layered onto the real scene. Maybe there never was a continuous movement because there was never a physical object making one. My brain showed me the figure in one location, then another, then another. That would explain why it looked as though frames were missing. It would also explain why it was completely gone when I returned later. The hallucinated image had ended. The real patio remained. That is probably the explanation I find most reasonable now, but as a child, it did not feel like a dream. It felt external. I looked through real glass at a real backyard and saw something standing there. I screamed because I believed there was an actual person or creature outside. That difference between explanation and experience matters. Even if the tree figure was created by a half-awake brain, the fear was completely real. Another possibility is that I saw an actual person. Maybe someone was on our patio carrying a tree, large branches, or some kind of plant. If the person's body was mostly hidden behind the branches, I might have seen only their feet underneath. That would create exactly the basic shape I remember. Tree on top, human feet below. Maybe a landscaper, neighbor, family member, or stranger was moving a plant. At a young age, I might not have understood what I was seeing. The problem is the timing. The patio was empty moments earlier. Then suddenly, this person was there. But someone could enter a backyard quickly. Maybe there was a gate I was not watching. Maybe they came from one side of the house. I only looked outside briefly the first time. The yard being empty at that moment does not mean nobody could arrive 30 seconds later. The movement toward me could also have been misunderstood. If someone was carrying a large tree or branches, walking might look strange because the upper body was hidden. I would see feet. Then the branches would sway. If they moved quickly toward the door, my young brain might describe it later as jumping. What I remember as disappearing between jumps could be caused by branches blocking my view of the legs. Or maybe sunlight and shadows made the movement appear broken. If a person took several large steps or hops while carrying something awkward, it could look unnatural. That possibility is much more ordinary than a tree creature. But then why was the person gone when I came back? Again, that is not impossible. I ran to my mother's room. I yelled. She told me to go away. Enough time passed for a person to leave. They could have simply continued across the patio and out of sight. If this was someone carrying a small Christmas tree or landscaping material, they would have had no reason to stay. Maybe I interrupted a completely normal moment and interpreted it through a child's limited understanding. Still, I remember the thing facing me. I remember it coming directly toward the glass. That is where the real person explanation becomes uncomfortable. If a stranger was actually rushing toward a child through a backyard door, that would be frightening for completely non-supernatural reasons. But there was no later evidence of anyone trespassing. My mother apparently did not find anyone. Nothing was stolen. Nobody tried to enter. So I doubt there was a dangerous person outside. There is also the possibility of an optical illusion. Back doors made of glass can create reflections. Depending on the brightness inside and outside, objects behind you can appear superimposed over the yard. Maybe a houseplant, artificial tree, coat rack, or some other object inside the house reflected in the glass. Then, as I moved toward the door, the reflection changed position. My own feet might have appeared underneath it. That could create something very close to the image I remember. A tree shape, human feet below it. Then when I moved, the figures seemed to move toward me. Reflections can behave in ways that are confusing to children. If I moved my head or body, the reflected object could jump relative to the background outside. The glitching might have come from my own rapid movement. I look. I step closer. Reflection changes. I blink. It appears closer again. From memory, that becomes 3 impossible jumps. This explanation becomes even stronger if there was anything tree-like inside the house near the door. But I do not remember there being one. The patio itself was empty, but I do not remember exactly what furniture or objects were behind me inside. 30 years later, that detail is gone. There might have been a plant, a hanging coat, a decoration, anything. The human feet might even have been mine, reflected faintly at the bottom of the glass. If the lighting lined up correctly, my brain could have combined 2 separate reflections into one person-like object. That sounds complicated now, but visual mistakes often are. The brain does not show you the raw information your eyes receive. It constructs an interpretation. Once it decides tree with feet, that becomes what you see. Another possibility is that there really was a tree or shrub outside that I had somehow never noticed. Maybe it was temporarily placed on the patio. Maybe someone had put it there the previous evening. I looked outside the first time and simply failed to register it. Then, on the second look, something made me notice it. That might sound unlikely, but inattentional blindness is real. People can look directly at objects without consciously noticing them if their attention is elsewhere. The first time I looked outside, I was hungry. My mind was already on breakfast. Maybe my eyes passed over the tree without storing it. Then, after discovering ice cream and running back excitedly, I looked again and suddenly noticed the object. Now, it seemed to have appeared from nowhere. If wind moved it, or if an animal was behind it, the lower section might have looked like feet. The problem is the rapid approach. A normal tree cannot jump across a patio. So again, either the movement was a perception error, or the memory has changed over time. And memory absolutely can change. This happened when I was a child. Every time I have thought about it since, I have replayed the same sequence. Empty patio. Tree appears, human feet. 3 glitched jumps. Face to glass. Scream. Over time, repeated memories can become more structured. Maybe there were not exactly 3 jumps. Maybe I remember 3 because that is how I have told the story. Maybe the thing moved in a more continuous way originally. Maybe the distance was shorter. Maybe it was not literally inches from my face. Fear compresses space and time. Something approaching quickly can feel as though it went from far away to right in front of you instantly. The emotional truth remains, even if measurements change. I was frightened by something I thought was moving toward me. That is the part I trust most. There is also the fact that I went back to check. That detail has always interested me. I was terrified enough to run to my mother, but once she dismissed me, I returned. Children are curious like that. Fear and curiosity fight each other constantly. I wanted safety, but I also needed to know if the thing was still outside. When I looked again, there was nothing. If I had found a tree lying on the patio, I might have understood what I saw. If I saw a neighbor carrying branches away, maybe the mystery would have ended. If I noticed a reflection in the door, same thing. Instead, there was simply nothing. That left my child brain with no explanation. Maybe that is why the memory stayed. Unresolved experiences tend to survive. If something strange gets explained immediately, the fear disappears. A shadow becomes a jacket. A monster becomes a dog. A ghost becomes someone's reflection. You laugh about it and move on. But when you return, and the source is gone, the original interpretation has nothing to replace it. So it remains. Tree with feet. That is still what I picture. I also find my mother's reaction interesting. She clearly did not believe there was a serious threat outside. But she was barely awake. When I yelled that someone was outside, she told me to go play. That sounds irresponsible when written out, but I can imagine the actual situation. A child who had already woken her once was now shouting about something strange. She was probably still half asleep and assumed I had seen a squirrel, shadow, or neighbor. Maybe I had a history of dramatic childhood fears. Maybe she simply did not process what I said. If she had immediately gotten up and looked outside, we might have had an answer. Instead, those few minutes disappeared. By the time I returned, whatever I had seen was gone. And of course, the ice cream part makes the whole morning feel even stranger. After all that terror, I still remembered the deal. That is such a perfect child priority. Possible monster outside? Terrifying, but Mom said yes to ice cream. Important, I went back and asked again. This time, she was awake enough to recognize what I was requesting. No ice cream. I ate cereal. Life continued. There was no second appearance that day. No tree creature returned the next morning. Nothing scratched at the glass. No strange footprints showed up on the patio. I never developed a pattern of seeing impossible figures outside. That lack of repetition is another reason I lean toward a waking dream or visual illusion. One unusual event during the minutes after getting out of bed. Then, never again. That fits sleep-related perception extremely well. If there were some actual unknown creature living around our home, I would expect more evidence. Instead, it existed only for a few seconds during one morning of my childhood. There are creatures in costumes that can look bizarre from a distance. A person wearing camouflage, someone carrying evergreen branches, a large bird spreading its wings, an animal standing partly hidden behind a shrub. Any of those could produce a strange first impression. But the human feet are so specific. I remember looking directly down and realizing that whatever this was, it had feet like a person. That is the moment the fear became real. A tree is harmless. A tree with feet means something is pretending to be a tree. That is how a child's mind interprets it. Maybe an adult would instantly see the person carrying it. A child sees the impossible object first. Then it moves. And once it began coming toward me, I did not stay long enough for a second interpretation. I ran before my brain could correct itself. That may be the entire explanation. I sometimes wonder whether my mother remembers any of this. Probably not. To her, it may have been one unremarkable morning when her child woke her repeatedly. First for ice cream, then because someone was supposedly outside, then again for ice cream. For me, those few minutes became one of the strangest visual memories I have from childhood. That difference is interesting. The event only became important because of who experienced it. If my mother had been standing beside me, maybe she would have said, "That's just someone carrying a tree." Memory gone. Instead, I was alone at the glass. So my brain had to interpret it without adult context. Even now, I do not think the best explanation is some supernatural tree creature. There is no reason to jump to that. A waking hallucination fits. A reflection fits parts of it. A real person carrying branches fits other parts. Childhood memory distortion could account for the strange movement. Probably some combination of those explains everything. But I understand why the experience never completely left me. It had one especially disturbing feature. The movement did not look like anything alive should move. That is what I still think about. I saw the feet prepare to jump. Then there was almost no middle. Then it was landing closer. Again, closer. Again, right at the glass. That kind of broken movement is exactly the sort of thing dreams can produce. It is also exactly the kind of thing that feels impossible when you experience it while believing you are awake. Maybe my brain was switching between images rather than watching real movement. Maybe I blinked during each jump. Maybe fear caused my memory to preserve only the starting and ending positions. Whatever happened, the result was the same. It felt as though the thing did not cross the space normally. It skipped through it. That is why, even now, the memory feels different from simply seeing a strange person outside. A person running toward the door would have been frightening. This was worse because I could not understand the motion. And yet the ending was completely ordinary. No attack, no broken window, no missing person report, no family legend, just a child screaming, a tired mother telling him to go play, and then cereal for breakfast. Maybe that ordinary ending is exactly what the experience needs. It keeps me from turning it into something bigger than it was. I saw something strange. I was very young. I had just woken up. It disappeared. That is all I can honestly claim. I do not know whether it was a dream layered over reality. I do not know whether someone was carrying a tree. I do not know whether the glass reflected something behind me. I do not know how much the memory has changed since childhood. But I know what I remember. I remember looking outside once and seeing an empty, patio. I remember discovering ice cream and running to get permission. I remember coming back excited enough that I could barely think about anything except breakfast. I remember pulling the curtain aside again, and this time there was a tree standing where nothing had been before. I remember looking down. Human feet. Then the first jump. The feet lifting. The middle of the movement somehow missing. The thing suddenly landing closer. Then another jump. Then another. Until the branches were almost against the glass and I was staring at it from only inches away. I ran screaming for my mother. When I finally forced myself to look outside again, there was nothing there. And somehow, after all that, I still went back to ask whether her half-asleep permission for ice cream counted. It did not. I had cereal. That was the end of it. No explanation ever followed. And more than anything else, what has stayed with me is not the idea that I saw some impossible creature. It is the certainty I had as a child that for a few seconds I was looking at something that was trying to imitate a tree, but had forgotten to hide its feet. When I was a kid, my mom and I used to see the same man walking around our house. That sounds like something I should be able to say with more hesitation now that I am older, but the reason it has stayed with me is because neither of us seemed to know the other was seeing him at first. At least, that is how I remember it. The house had plenty of strange moments while I was growing up, but the man was one of the earliest things that made me feel like maybe I was not imagining everything. I was about 7 years old the first time I remember seeing him clearly enough to describe. It happened at night. I was asleep in my bedroom when I woke up because someone seemed to be coming into the room. At that age, waking up and seeing an adult-sized person in your doorway is confusing before it is frightening. Your first thought is usually that it has to be a parent. They're not supposed to be random adults walking through your house at night. So my brain automatically tried to fit the person into someone familiar. But this was not my mom. It was not anyone I recognized. I remember looking at him long enough to notice details, not just a vague shadow, not just a dark shape. A man. I could see what he was wearing. I could remember the little details well enough that when I ran to wake my mom, I described him to her. What shocked me was her reaction. Instead of telling me I had dreamed it, she realized I was describing the same man she had been seeing. According to her, she had already noticed him in the house more than once. She had kept it to herself because she thought maybe she was losing her mind. Then her 7-year-old child woke her in the middle of the night and described the same person, down to the accessories. That was the moment, for both of us, when the whole thing became harder to dismiss. From my point of view as a child, it meant one thing. The man was real. Maybe not alive, maybe not physically real in the normal sense, but real enough that both of us had seen him. From my mom's point of view, I imagine it was probably more unsettling. Adults are supposed to be the people who explain things. If your kid tells you they saw a man in the house and then describes the same figure you have privately been seeing, there is suddenly no easy role to fall back on. You cannot simply say, you had a nightmare, without also asking yourself why the nightmare looks like yours. That stayed in the background for years. We would have other strange experiences in the house. Small things, sounds, movement, things that were hard to explain but not impossible to explain. Most houses produce their own noises. Wood shifts, pipes knock, doors move, lights flicker, objects fall. If you already believe a place is haunted, every one of those events starts to feel connected. That is one thing I understand better now. Once my mom and I agreed that we had seen the same man, Everything else in the house had a ready-made explanation. The man did it, or another spirit did. That does not mean the experiences were fake. It just means our interpretation had somewhere to go. One of the most obvious incidents happened when I was a few years older. I was probably around 12 or 13. I had done some kind of school project and could not find it. My mom had told me she had put it under her bed, so I went into her bedroom to look. I checked underneath the bed. Nothing. I moved things around. Still nothing. I became frustrated. At 12 or 13, frustration can turn into a full rant very quickly. I started complaining out loud. Then I started swearing. I was probably blaming everyone except myself for losing the project. I was annoyed, talking to nobody in particular, and not thinking about ghosts or the man my mom and I had seen. Then something happened in the ensuite bathroom. My mom's bathroom had a light with one of those long pull cords or hanging handles. You pulled it downward to switch the light on or off. While I was in the bedroom ranting, that light pull suddenly yanked downward. Hard, not a small movement, not a slight swing. It looked as though someone had grabbed it and pulled it with force. The light switched. Then the long hanging cord or handle started swinging violently back and forth. I stopped talking. Whatever anger I had about the school project disappeared instantly. There is a very specific kind of fear that happens when something moves in a way that looks intentional. If a book falls from a shelf, gravity is the first explanation. If a light flickers, electricity. If a door creaks, airflow. But when a hanging cord suddenly gets pulled straight down and then starts swinging hard, your brain immediately imagines a hand. That was what terrified me. It looked like something had reacted to me. I had been swearing and ranting. Then the light was yanked. At that age, the connection felt obvious. I had angered something. Maybe the man. Maybe some other presence in the house. Whatever was there had heard me and did not like the way I was talking. I got out of that room. Fast, I ran downstairs to my mom. My heart was pounding. I must have looked terrible, because she could tell immediately that I was genuinely scared. I told her what happened. She came upstairs with me. That was another detail that made the event stick. By the time we got back to the room, the light was still on, and the pull cord was still moving. It had not completely stopped. My mom could see it swinging. So once again, I was not the only person involved. She did not witness the original pull. That distinction is important. She did not see an invisible hand yank it down. But she saw the aftermath. The light was on. The cord was still swinging. That was enough at the time. I remember the feeling of standing there with her and realizing I had not just imagined the cord moving. Something physical had happened. The question was what? As a kid, I already had my answer. Ghost, possibly the same man. I had been disrespectful. It responded. Simple. Looking back now, there are plenty of normal possibilities I did not consider at 12 or 13. The first is that the pull mechanism itself may have malfunctioned. Those ceiling pull switches are mechanical devices. They contain springs, contacts, cords, and moving parts. If something inside is worn, jammed, or under tension, it could potentially release unexpectedly. A cord could shift. A spring could snap into a different position. The switch might activate without anyone intentionally pulling it. If that happened suddenly enough, the hanging cord could swing. The movement might look much more forceful than the actual mechanical cause. I do not know what condition that light switch was in. I never took it apart. I was not checking for a loose mechanism. I saw movement and ran. That means the most obvious physical evidence was never inspected. Airflow is another possibility, though it seems less satisfying for the initial downward movement. A bathroom can have ventilation. an extractor fan, an open window. Pressure changes when doors open and close. A long pull cord can swing dramatically if air catches it, especially after it has already been displaced. That could explain why it continued moving after I left. Once the cord was swinging, it would take time to settle. My mom and I returning before it stopped does not prove the cause was paranormal. It only confirms that the cord had been moving recently. There could also have been some vibration through the ceiling or wall. Someone above us. Plumbing, a door slamming elsewhere, heavy movement through the house. A pull cord hanging from a ceiling fitting can react to vibrations. Though again, a clean downward tug would be harder to produce. Memory also matters. I remember it as a violent yank. That was the emotional core of the moment. But years later, I cannot measure how far it actually moved. Maybe the cord dropped because something in the mechanism released, then swung hard. My child brain interpreted that as a hand pulling it. That does not mean I invented the movement. It means I assigned intention to it. Humans are incredibly sensitive to intention. If something moves in a way that resembles an action we recognize, we imagine an actor. A chair slides. Someone pushed it. A door closes. Someone shut it. A light pull drops. Someone pulled it. Sometimes that assumption is correct. Sometimes physics accidentally imitates behavior. The timing made it worse. I was swearing. Then the light moved. That felt like a response. But timing can create meaning even when two things are unrelated. If I had been quietly looking for the school project and the pull cord moved, I might have thought the switch was broken. Because I was ranting, the event became punishment. That interpretation came from context. The cord did not speak. It did not tell me to stop swearing. It did not move again every time I cursed. There was only one movement during one emotional moment. Still, I understand why 13-year-old me took it personally. The earlier history with the man made that explanation available. By then, the house already felt capable of containing someone we could not fully explain. I had seen him. My mom had seen him. We had apparently described the same person independently. That previous experience gave the light incident a supernatural framework. Without the man, the bathroom light might have been creepy. With the man, it felt like communication. I have thought about the shared sightings more carefully as I got older, too. They are still the most difficult part for me. If my mom and I truly describe the same unknown man independently, down to very specific details, that is more interesting than a door moving or a light cord swinging. But memory and communication can be complicated. I was 7. How much had my mom said around me before that night? Maybe she had mentioned a strange man in a dream. Maybe I had overheard adults talking. Maybe there was a photograph somewhere. Maybe I had seen a person near the house previously and stored the image. Children absorb information adults do not realize they are sharing. It is possible my description felt completely independent while actually being influenced by something I had heard earlier. There is also the possibility that my mom's memory of what she had been seeing became more specific after I described the man. That does not mean she was lying. Memory can align very quickly. If two people have vague experiences and then discuss them, overlapping details become stronger. One says, he wore this. The other thinks, yes, that fits what I saw. Years later, both remember having seen the detail before the conversation. That is a normal memory process. Again, it does not mean nothing happened. It means shared memories are not perfect laboratory evidence. Sleep also matters. My clearest childhood encounter happened when I woke up in bed. That is exactly when people can have vivid dream imagery overlapping with a real room. A person standing in the doorway or walking into a bedroom is one of the most common shapes those experiences can take. You wake. The room is real. The door is real. But part of the dream is still present. The figure feels completely external. I may have had a sleep-related experience. My mom may have had her own unrelated one. If both of us had heard family stories, seen the same photograph, or lived in the same visual environment, our brains could create similar figures. That is less dramatic than a ghost, but it is possible. What makes it emotionally difficult to dismiss is how certain I remember being. I did not wake my mom and say, I saw a shadow. I described a man, and her reaction told me I had matched something she recognized. That moment became a foundation for everything that followed. Once a child believes a specific ghost is walking around the house changes. Hallways become places he might appear. Doorways become important. Movement at the edge of vision becomes him. You start noticing patterns. My mom may have experienced the same thing from the opposite direction. Her child had apparently confirmed the figure. Now, every strange event also reinforced her belief. Two people can unintentionally strengthen each other's interpretations without either being dishonest. That is one of the most grounded ways I can understand what happened. But the bathroom light incident was different because it involved an object physically moving. There was no figure to misidentify, no half-awake state. I was awake, frustrated, looking for a school project. The light pole moved. The light came on. I ran downstairs. My mom returned with me and saw the cord still swinging. That gives the story a physical anchor. Something caused the movement. The mystery is whether the cause was mechanical, environmental, accidental, or something we could not explain. I cannot honestly say more than that. At the time, though, I was sure I had pissed something off. The fact that I had been swearing seemed too perfectly timed. I remember wondering whether the man we saw was some older spirit who did not like hearing a kid talk that way, almost like a strict adult correcting me. That interpretation softened the fear a little. A ghost that enforces manners is less frightening than a random hostile presence. But I never saw the man standing beside the bathroom. There was no voice, no visible hand. Connecting him to that incident was my assumption. It could have been something entirely unrelated. My family had a lot of stories from that house. Enough that when I think about childhood, the place feels full of strange moments. That creates another problem with memory. When many stories collect around one location, they begin to support each other. One event that would seem minor on its own becomes part of a pattern. The man, the light, other things. Soon the house has an identity. Haunted, once that label exists, everything gets sorted through it. A strange noise in a normal house is plumbing. A strange noise in a haunted house is the ghost. The label changes interpretation before investigation even begins. That does not prove the label was wrong. It just means it can reinforce itself. I am more careful about that now. I try to separate the experiences. The man is one question. The light cord is another. Whatever else happened is separate too. If one event has a normal explanation, that does not explain all the others. And if one event remains unexplained, that does not prove every strange thing was paranormal. The light could have been mechanical, even if the man was something stranger. The man could have been sleep-related, even if another event in the house had a physical cause. There does not need to be one answer for everything. That is probably the biggest difference between how I think about it now and how I thought about it as a kid. Back then, one ghost explained the whole house. Now, I think a house can produce dozens of unrelated mysteries. Some are perception, some are memory, some are mechanics, some are coincidence. and maybe a few remain genuinely unexplained. That last category is enough. I do not need to call it proof. I also do not need to pretend the experiences meant nothing. The fear was real. My mom's reaction was real. The cord really was still swinging when she came upstairs, at least as I remember it. Those details are part of my childhood, whether the explanation is supernatural or not. I also think about how lucky I was that my mom listened. A lot of kids tell adults they saw someone and get laughed at. My mom took me seriously because she had her own reason to. That probably made the experience more intense, but it also meant I was not dealing with the fear alone. When the light moved years later, I knew exactly where to run. Mom, she came upstairs. She checked. She saw something had happened. Even if we did not understand it, I was not the only one standing there. That mattered. If I had gone back alone and the cord had already stopped, maybe I would have spent years wondering if I imagined everything. Instead, she saw the aftermath. That does not prove a ghost pulled it, but it does give me confidence that I did not invent the entire physical event. Something moved that pull. I just do not know what. The school project almost becomes funny in hindsight. I do not even remember what the project was. Whatever assignment seemed important enough for me to have a complete rant has disappeared from memory. I remember the missing project only because of what happened while I searched for it. The ordinary problem vanished. The strange moment survived. That is how memory works. The emotional event stays. The reason you were in the room gets blurry. I can picture myself looking under the bed, getting angrier, swearing out loud. Then the sudden movement from the bathroom, the light coming on, the pull cord whipping back and forth, the instant change in my body, anger to fear, then running downstairs. That transition is still very clear. People sometimes ask why, if the house was supposedly so active, we stayed there. The answer is simple. It was our home. Most of the time, nothing happened. That is another thing ghost stories leave out. A house can contain one frightening minute and thousands of completely normal hours. You still eat dinner there, do homework, watch television, argue with siblings, sleep, wake up. Life keeps going. Even if something happens that you cannot explain, you eventually have to go back into the room. I went into my mom's bedroom again. The bathroom light kept working. The pull cord became an ordinary household object again. The man did not appear every night. Normal life gradually covered the fear until the next strange thing happened. That is why I do not describe the house as some constant nightmare. It was not. It was just a place where enough odd things happened that my family still remembers them. If I had the chance to go back now, I would want to inspect that bathroom switch. I would pull the cord repeatedly, check whether it could stick, see how the mechanism behaved. Look at ventilation, see whether slamming another door made it move, test how long it swung after a hard pull. Maybe I would solve the entire thing in 5 minutes. That would not disappoint me. I would actually like an answer. The same goes for the man. I would want to know if there were old family photographs we had seen. A previous owner, a neighbor, someone who visited the house when I was little. Any visual source that could explain why my mom and I remembered the same person. Maybe there is one, maybe not. But childhood did not give us the tools or interest to investigate that way. We experienced first and interpreted second. That is what kids do. So the story stayed simple for years. My mom and I saw the same ghost. Then, years later, I made something in the house angry, and it yanked the bathroom light. That is the version childhood gave me. The adult version is less certain. I saw a man while waking from sleep. My mom believed the description matched someone she had independently perceived. Later, a ceiling pull switch activated violently while I was alone in her bedroom. My mom saw the cord continuing to swing afterward. There may be normal explanations for all of it, but I cannot reconstruct them now. I do not know whether the man and the light had anything to do with each other. I do not know whether the house was haunted. I know only that enough happened there to make that possibility feel very real to us at the time. And out of all the stories from that house, the bathroom light is still one of the easiest for me to replay. I was around 12 or 13, angry because I could not find a school project. I was on the floor or near the bed, complaining and swearing. Then, from the ensuite bathroom, the long light pull snapped downward, with enough force to switch the light on. The cord started swinging violently. I stopped swearing. I ran. By the time my mom followed me upstairs, the room was empty. No man, no person hiding in the bathroom. No obvious explanation. Just the light still burning and the long pull cord slowly losing momentum. Maybe it was a mechanical fault. Maybe I had disturbed something without realizing it. Maybe the timing made a normal malfunction feel like a response. Those possibilities make sense. But when I remember being 13, standing beside my mom, and watching that cord still move, I also remember thinking about the man we had both seen years earlier, and wondering if, somewhere in that house, he had finally gotten tired of listening to me swear.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.